Welcome to GrowLeap Academy, the podcast where we decode modern life, one powerful idea at a time. Let me ask you something. Have you ever caught yourself scrolling endlessly late at night, switching between 5 different apps, snacking just to feel something and thinking, what am I even doing? You're not lazy. You're not broken. You're just living in a world that's completely out of balance. Today, we're diving into the book Dopamine Nation by Dr. Anna Lembke. And it's a game changer. We'll talk about how constant stimulation hijacks our brains, why more pleasure often leads to more pain, and how to finally find balance in a world built to keep us addicted. This episode is honest, practical, and a little uncomfortable. In the best way. Let's get into it.
Okay, so you guys sent in a really interesting mix this time.
Yeah.
A bunch of articles, research studies, even some personal stories.
Yeah, some really powerful ones.
Yeah, and I mean, a pretty clear theme jumped out at us right from the beginning.
Definitely.
Like it's all about this weird relationship between pleasure and pain.
Yeah.
And how, like, the way we live now might be messing with that balance. You know, like the balance that's kind of been there forever.
Yeah, like our natural equilibrium.
Yeah, and maybe even leading us to, like, overdoing it with stuff. Even addiction.
Absolutely. That's at the heart of it all. Think of this deep dive as like a crash course in like what it means to be human.
I like that.
You know, we've gone through all this material and pulled out the most important bits, the stuff that'll make you go, whoa, I never thought of it that way. You know, those kind of facts that help you understand yourself better and the world around you.
Okay, so first things first, let's talk about dopamine.
Yeah, that's a big one.
It's like everywhere in these sources. And apparently scientists see it as this like universal signal for how addictive something can be.
Yeah, it's like the brain's reward currency, you know? The more dopamine something triggers, the more you crave it.
Even if it's not good for you.
Exactly. And here's another wild thing. Our brains don't have separate areas for pleasure and pain. They're processed in the same place.
So it's like two sides of the same coin.
Exactly.
And that's where this pleasure-pain balance idea comes in, right?
Yeah. Picture a seesaw.
Okay.
Pleasure on one side, pain on the other. They're constantly trying to find a balance.
We've all felt that, right? Like
Yeah.
that urge to have just one more piece of cake,
Yeah,
even though you know you're full.
totally. Or like when you're reading a good book and you just don't want it to end. That's the balance tipping towards the wanting side.
Yeah, towards like not having enough or wanting something to last forever.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so that's the balance. Now let's talk about how the world has changed
Mm-hmm.
and how that balance has been affected.
Right, especially when it comes to access to stuff that can really throw it off.
Yeah, starting with all these potent substances. The sources actually take us back in time a bit.
Yeah, and you know what's crazy is how technology, even when it's meant to do good, can sometimes have these unintended consequences.
Right.
Like it can make things way more addictive without anyone really planning for that. Like take cigarettes.
Yeah.
Back in 1880, they invented the cigarette rolling machine, and production went from like 4 cigarettes a minute to 20,000.
20,000 a minute. That's insane.
It's a huge jump, and that one invention basically changed everything.
And look at us now. 6.5 trillion cigarettes sold every year.
Crazy, right?
18 billion every day.
And like 6 million deaths a year because of them.
Yeah, it's a pretty sobering example of how just making something easier to get can lead to, well, massive problems.
Exactly. And then you've got the story of opioids. Morphine, which they figured out back in 1805, turned out to be like 10 times stronger than opium. And then in 1853, they invented the hypodermic syringe. So suddenly you could inject this powerful painkiller right into your bloodstream.
Talk about efficiency.
Yeah, but it backfired. By the late 1800s, tons of people were addicted to morphine, and doctors were the ones giving it to them.
Wow.
It's a classic example of how medical progress, even with good intentions, can lead to unintended addiction problems.
It really shows you can't just rely on good intentions.
Yeah.
And it didn't stop there, did it? Like the search for a less addictive opioid.
Yeah, you'd think they'd learn, right? They came up with heroin, and they even named it after the German word for heroic.
Oh, wow.
The irony is tragic because heroin ended up being way stronger than morphine, like 2 to 5 times stronger.
Oh, no.
And that's what caused the huge narkomania epidemic in the early 1900s.
It's a stark reminder that our attempts to solve problems can sometimes make them so much worse. And this quest for stronger and stronger stuff hasn't stopped, has it?
Not at all. Now we have these super strong synthetic opioids.
What kinds?
Like oxycodone, hydrocodone, hydromorphone, you name it, they've got it. And in all sorts of forms.
It's scary how available they are.
Yeah. And, it really hit home for me when I had a patient come in a few years ago, and he was casually sucking on a fentanyl lollipop.
A lollipop.
Yeah, fentanyl is like 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine. That just shows you how powerful these drugs have become.
And how easy they are to get. And it's not just drugs in the traditional sense.
Right.
Even nicotine, like the way we get our nicotine, has changed dramatically.
Yeah, electronic cigarettes. They're often marketed as a safer alternative, but they can actually deliver way more nicotine and way faster than regular cigarettes.
Really?
Yeah, and all those flavors they come in, especially the ones that appeal to younger people, are just another way to make them more addictive.
So it's not just about access and potency with physical substances. The internet and technology are also playing a huge role in all this, right?
Absolutely. And it's not just about making it easier to get drugs, both the old ones and the new ones. It's about creating entirely new ways to become addicted to things that people might never have even considered before.
Like what?
Think about viral content. Those videos and memes that spread like wildfire online, they can introduce and normalize all sorts of behaviors.
That's a great point. The sources talk about this one disturbing example where an anime cartoon is thought to have contributed to cases of sexual abuse.
It's a really disturbing example of how quickly dangerous ideas and behaviors can spread online, especially among vulnerable people.
And then there's this guy, Jacob, whose story is in the sources. He's a really powerful example, although a disturbing one, of how technology can fuel a gradual descent into compulsive behavior.
Right.
He started with a homemade device for, and then he moved on to online pornography, then to chat rooms where people were like, live.
Yeah.
And it culminated in him using this homemade TNS unit for stimulation.
Which is incredibly dangerous.
Extremely dangerous. And what's really disturbing is that there was this whole online community encouraging and even guiding him. It's like these risky activities become totally normal, even celebrated in certain corners of the internet.
Yeah, people lose sight of the real-world dangers. And when we step back and look at the bigger picture, it raises some serious questions about our society as a whole. Like, are we somehow making ourselves more vulnerable to this kind of compulsive overconsumption?
Yeah, the sources talk about dopamine economy and limbic capitalism.
Yeah.
These ideas that technology is now designed to specifically target our brain's reward systems.
Right.
Not just by making things more accessible, but also by offering us more variety, more intense dopamine hits, like stronger drugs in a way.
Exactly. And then you look at some of the worrying trends in society, things like deaths of despair. Have you heard of that?
Yeah.
It's this thing happening among middle-aged white Americans without a college degree, where the leading causes of death are drug overdoses, alcohol-related liver disease, and suicide.
Yeah, it's really sad. It paints a pretty bleak picture of a certain segment of the population that's really struggling and turning to unhealthy coping mechanisms.
And it's not just them. We're seeing increases in alcohol use and addiction across the board, actually.
Yeah.
Did you know that back in the 1990s, the number of adults who said they drink alcohol went up by almost 50%?
Wow.
And we're seeing big increases in risky drinking and addiction in older adults and women, too, groups that used to be less affected.
That's concerning.
It really shows you that when you make potent rewards easily available, it can create its own demand. The easier it is to get those intense pleasures, the more likely people are to get caught in that addictive cycle.
Yeah. And the sources point out how vulnerable people in lower socioeconomic groups and those with less education are to all of this.
Right. It's like this perfect storm. They're surrounded by easily accessible, high-reward drugs, but they often lack access to the things that can protect them and give their lives, meaning, things like fulfilling work, safe housing, good education, affordable health care, and just basic equality. It's a recipe for addiction.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The sources also talk about how we view pain and discomfort these days and how that might be part of the problem.
Right. Our modern approach to pain is really interesting. Like, Historically, people had different ideas about pain. There was this 17th century doctor, Thomas Sydenham.
I've heard of him.
He actually said that a little bit of pain could be good for you.
Interesting.
But now we're all about eliminating pain. Like, if we feel any pain, we think something's wrong.
And we reach for the pills.
Exactly. It's not surprising that we see so many prescriptions for psychiatric medications. Did you know that over 25% of American adults and more than 5% of kids are taking a psychiatric drug every day?
Wow.
And the U.S. is way ahead of other developed countries when it comes to antidepressant use.
It makes you wonder if we're over-medicating, right? Like maybe we're trying to erase all discomfort instead of learning to deal with it.
Yeah, and there's this other idea in the sources about how we're maybe overprotecting our kids. Like, by shielding them from every little bit of adversity, we might actually be making them less resilient and more likely to seek out intense pleasures later on.
That makes sense. Like they never develop the tools to cope with difficult emotions.
Right.
And there's this constant need for distraction. Remember Aldous Huxley?
Oh, yeah. He was ahead of his time.
Yeah, he talked about how our mass media was feeding this hunger for the unreal and the irrelevant.
And it's only gotten worse, right? Like the anecdote in the sources about the patient who couldn't even walk to class without being plugged into something really struck a chord with me.
It's like we're afraid to be alone with our thoughts.
And then she tried going without her devices, and she was amazed by how much she noticed her surroundings, like the trees and stuff.
It's like we're missing out on the beauty of the present moment because we're so busy distracting ourselves. Okay, so we've got this world overflowing with easy pleasure where we avoid pain at all costs, and technology keeps us constantly stimulated. It sounds kind of bleak.
It does, doesn't it?
So what can we do about it? What do these sources suggest?
Well, one really interesting thing they talk about is this thing called the Dopamine Framework.
Okay, tell me more about that.
So it's basically a set of steps to help you reset your pleasure-pain balance. And the first step, the D, is for dopamine fasting or abstinence. It's all about giving your brain a break from those high dopamine activities and rewards so it can kind of recalibrate.
Like a reset button. It goes back to that balance we were talking about, right? If you abstain from the things that are giving you those intense dopamine hits, the cravings and discomfort will eventually start to quiet down.
Exactly. And the next step, the O, is for objectives. It's about figuring out what you actually want to achieve.
Right, like having clear goal. They talk about this woman, Delilah, who was trying to cut back on weed.
Yeah.
And she found it helpful to think about her future self and how continuing to use would affect her relationship with her family. Having that clear why really helped her stay motivated.
Makes sense. And then there's the P, which stands for paying attention or mindfulness. This is super important, especially when you're first cutting back on something you've been overdoing.
Like a substance or a behavior.
Exactly, because here's the thing. When you first stop, you're probably going to feel worse before you feel better. It's called withdrawal-mediated anxiety, and it's totally normal.
So it gets worse before it gets better.
Yeah, but it's temporary. A lot of people find that things start to turn around after about 2 months.
Good to know. The sources also talk about this woman, Delilah, who realized that even though she still liked weed, she actually felt like her best self when she was sober.
Yeah, it's amazing how resilient our brains are, you know?
Totally.
If you can push through that initial discomfort, you can really start to see the positive effects.
Okay, so we've got D for dopamine fasting, O for objectives, P for paying attention. What's next?
The next A is for abstinence, which kind of reinforces that first step of taking a break.
Makes sense.
And then you've got another M for mindfulness. It's about learning to just be present with your thoughts and feelings without always needing to distract yourself.
It goes back to that example of the woman who couldn't walk to class without her devices.
Right. Once she started paying attention to her surroundings, she realized how much she'd been missing.
Okay, so that's dopamine fasting, objectives, paying attention, abstinence, and mindfulness. What about the I in dopamine?
I is for insight. Basically, it's about understanding your own patterns of behavior and the things that trigger your compulsions.
Oh, like what makes you want to overdo something? And then N is for next steps.
Exactly. This one's interesting because it recognizes that even after you've been abstinent for a while, you might still feel the urge to go back to your old habits, but hopefully in a more controlled way.
Right, like you might still want to have a glass of wine or play a video game, but you want to do it in a way that doesn't take over your life.
Right. And they talk about this guy, Jacob, who relapsed after watching TV in a hotel room. It sounds so harmless,
Yeah, it does.
but it triggered him, and he ended up going back to using his electrical stimulation device. It just goes to show how easily those old patterns can sneak back in.
So you have to be really vigilant, even after you think you've got things under control.
Exactly. And the last one, the E, is for experiment. Basically, finding that balance is an ongoing process. You have to keep trying different things and see what works best for you.
It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. Okay, so that's the dopamine framework. The sources also talk about self-binding, right?
Yes, self-binding is fascinating. It's basically about intentionally putting up barriers between yourself and those things you tend to overdo. And there are a few different types.
Like what?
Well, the most straightforward one is physical self-binding. You know that story about Odysseus and the sirens?
Yeah.
He knew he wouldn't be able to resist their song, so he had his crew put beeswax in their ears, and he had himself tied to the mast of the ship.
That's a pretty extreme example.
It is, but it perfectly illustrates the concept of creating physical barriers to prevent yourself from giving in to temptation.
That makes sense. And are there any modern-day examples of that?
Yeah, definitely. Like, there's this guy, Oscar, in the sources. He decided to get rid of all the alcohol in his house and even started locking up any alcohol that came in.
So he was making it physically harder for himself to drink.
Exactly. And then there's pharmacological self-binding, which is about using medication to change your body's response to certain substances.
Like what kinds of medications?
Well, for alcohol addiction, there are medications like naltrexone and disulfiram. Naltrexone blocks the opioid receptors, so you don't get that same pleasurable feeling from alcohol.
Interesting. So it makes drinking less rewarding.
Exactly. And the disulfiram makes you really sick if you drink alcohol.
That's a pretty strong deterrent.
Yeah. But there are some nuances to this approach. The sources talk about how naltrexone can also reduce your enjoyment of other pleasurable activities, so some people only take it when they need it.
That makes sense.
And there's this guy, Arnold, whose wife had to administer his disulfiram because he had problems with his frontal lobe function, which is the part of the brain that helps with decision-making and impulse control.
So it's not just about the medication itself, it's also about having the right support system in place.
Absolutely. And sometimes even seemingly unrelated medical interventions can have unintended consequences. Like some people who have weight loss surgery actually develop alcohol addiction afterwards.
Really?
Yeah, it seems like it can mess with the body's reward system in some way.
That's fascinating. Are there other types of self-binding?
Yeah, there's also categorical self-binding, which is about avoiding entire categories of triggers.
Okay, give me an example of that.
Sure. So remember Jacob, who relapsed after watching TV? After that, he decided to avoid all sexually suggestive images. He knew that was a major trigger for him.
So he was basically cutting himself off from anything that could lead him back to his old habits.
Exactly. And then there's this other guy, Mitch, who was addicted to gambling. He decided to completely avoid all sports-related content because that's what triggered his urges to bet.
Wow, that's a pretty big commitment.
It is. And it's not always easy. Like, the sources talk about how the gluten-free diet trend has actually made it harder for some people with gluten sensitivity to avoid gluten because there are now so many gluten-free versions of their favorite foods.
That's an interesting point. It's like the market is making it harder to stick to your boundaries.
Right. And then there's this other interesting concept called deifying the demonized, where something that's normally taboo is given a sacred or ritualistic context. Like some cultures use mind-altering substances in religious ceremonies.
Yeah, like ayahuasca and peyote in some indigenous cultures.
Right. And the recent trend of using psychedelics in therapy, but in a very controlled setting, seems to reflect this idea of controlled access and intentional use.
That's a really interesting comparison. Okay, so we've talked a lot about avoiding pleasure and things like that, but the sources also talk about this idea of pressing on the pain side.
Yeah, and I gotta say, this was one of the most intriguing parts for me.
Yeah, it was pretty eye-opening, like the story about this guy, Michael, who gets high from taking cold showers and ice baths.
Right. It's wild. It seems like he's tapping into some kind of primal mechanism in his body.
Yeah, it's like he's triggering a pleasure response through discomfort.
Yeah.
And the sources point out that using cold water for its health benefits has been a thing for centuries.
Totally. And there's this study from Charles University that shows how just 1 hour of being immersed in cold water can cause significant increases in dopamine and norepinephrine.
Wow, and how much of an increase are we talking about?
Like dopamine goes up by 250% and norepinephrine by 530%.
That's huge. So you're basically hacking your brain's reward system.
And get this. The levels of these neurochemicals stay elevated even after you get out of the cold water.
So the discomfort leads to a lasting feeling of pleasure. That's really counterintuitive.
Yeah, it's like tricking your body into feeling good. So basically, the idea is that when you experience this initial discomfort, it triggers your body's natural balancing mechanisms.
Right, like your body is trying to get back to a state of equilibrium.
Exactly. And as it does that, it releases a flood of those feel-good chemicals. And this ties into the concept of hormesis.
Look, kids.
The idea that small doses of stress, like from cold, heat, or exercise, can actually be good for you.
Interesting. So maybe our comfy, sedentary lifestyles are actually part of the problem. Like maybe we're not stimulating our bodies enough.
Yeah. And they talk about this idea that addiction might be fueled, at least in part, by drugs reminding us that we have bodies.
That's a really interesting way to think about it. And there's no denying the benefits of exercise. Like it's been proven to improve mood, reduce anxiety, boost brain function, increase energy, and help you sleep better.
Totally. It's like a wonder drug, but without the side effects.
Right. But of course, seeking out discomfort isn't exactly easy or natural.
No, it goes against our instincts. It takes conscious effort. But like we've been saying, the benefits can be worth it.
Yeah. Even something like ECT, electroconvulsive therapy.
Yeah, which is a pretty intense treatment.
Yeah. But even that can be seen as a form of hormesis, like a shock to the system that triggers a healing response.
Right. And the sources talk about these examples of therapy homework where people intentionally put themselves in uncomfortable situations to overcome their anxieties.
Yeah, like that guy David, who forced himself to make small talk with strangers to get over his social anxiety.
Yeah, and then there was this other example of someone intentionally spilling their coffee at Starbucks to get used to the feeling of embarrassment.
It's like facing your fears head on,
Right.
like using discomfort as a tool for growth.
Exactly. But, there's always the risk of going too far.
Right, too much of a good thing and all that.
Yeah, like they mentioned this study about skydivers who started experiencing anhedonia, which is like a lack of pleasure.
So they were getting so used to the adrenaline rush that nothing else could compare.
Right. And then there's overtraining syndrome, which is something that can happen to extreme athletes who push themselves too hard.
So it's like you can get addicted to pain.
It's possible. It just goes to show that even with things that are generally good for you, you have to find that balance.
Moderation in all things.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, so another big theme that comes up in these sources is radical honesty.
Yeah, and it's so powerful.
It is. They tell this story about a woman named Maria who was hiding her drinking problem. And it wasn't until she finally confessed the truth to her brother that things started to change for her.
It's like being radically honest with yourself and others creates this shift. It helps you become more self-aware, it deepens your connections with people, and it forces you to take responsibility for your life.
Like you're creating a more authentic narrative for yourself.
Exactly. And they even bring up that Greek myth about Odysseus and the sirens. He had to tell his story to break the siren's spell. It's a beautiful metaphor for how honesty can help us overcome our demons.
That's a great analogy. And the sources also talk about some research that shows how stimulating the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that's responsible for decision-making and impulse control, can actually increase honesty.
Right. And you even shared your own experience with this, right?
Yeah, I was struggling with compulsive reading, and it wasn't until I actually said it out loud to my therapist that I realized how much it was affecting my life. And that was the first step in breaking free from it.
It's like saying it out loud gives it power, makes it real.
Totally. And the sources talk about how honesty can strengthen relationships because it shows vulnerability.
And when you're vulnerable with someone, it lets them know that it's okay for them to be vulnerable too.
Right. And it creates this sense of trust and connection. And that can trigger the release of dopamine and oxytocin, those feel-good hormones.
It's the opposite of what happens when we're caught in a cycle of compulsive overconsumption, which usually leads to isolation and secrecy.
And they make this distinction between drunkalogs, which are those superficial stories we sometimes tell in support groups.
Yeah, where we kind of gloss over the truth.
Right, and real deep honesty. It's like, for real healing to happen, we have to own our stories, warts and all. We can't just play the victim.
We have to take responsibility for our choices. And when we do that, it can actually lead to what they call a plenty mindset.
Which is?
Like, even when things are tough, you can still feel a sense of abundance because you have those strong connections with people and you're living a life that's true to yourself.
That's a powerful idea. They tell a story about a guy named Drake who got a DUI. And instead of trying to get away with it, he decided to be completely honest with his lawyer. And guess what? The lawyer was so moved that he gave him his money back. Yeah, of course, there are always complexities like race and class that play into these situations. But the point is that being honest can have these unexpected positive consequences.
It's about living in alignment with your values even when it's hard.
Absolutely. Okay, last but not least, the sources talk about pro-social shame.
Yeah, this one can be tricky to wrap your head around. It's not about feeling ashamed of yourself in a way that makes you want to hide or keep doing the things you're ashamed of.
It's more nuanced than that.
Right. It's about feeling shame in a way that motivates you to change.
Okay, what's the key difference between the two?
It's all about how other people respond to you. Like, if you open up about something you're struggling with and people judge you or reject you,
That's not helpful at all.
right, it just makes you want to withdraw and hide even more. That's destructive shame. But if people respond with empathy, support, and understanding,
Then it can actually help you to heal.
exactly, that's pro-social shame. And they talk about this woman, Lori, who tried to be open with her church elders about her struggles.
Yeah, and how did that go?
Not well. She felt judged and rejected.
That's so sad. It really highlights how sometimes religious organizations, with the best of intentions, can actually make things worse.
Totally. But then Lori found Alcoholics Anonymous, and she described it as a de-shaming process. It was a place where she could be completely honest about her struggles without being judged.
That's so important.
And they talk about this concept of club goods in groups like AA, where everyone benefits from being honest and upholding the group's values. Like when someone relapses and they're honest about it, it actually strengthens the bonds within the group.
Yeah, it's like a shared commitment to supporting each other through those tough times.
Yeah.
And they have these pretty strict rules about people who try to take advantage of the group without putting in the work.
Yeah, like that woman, Joan, who relapsed after having just a tiny bit of alcohol. She had to reset her sobriety date, even though it was such a small slip-up.
Wow, that seems harsh.
Yeah, but it's all about maintaining the integrity of the group. And in the end, Lori found the acceptance and belonging she was looking for in AA.
It's a powerful reminder that we all need that kind of support, especially when we're struggling. And it's not just informal support groups. Like they talk about this example of someone who was honest with their kids about stealing chocolate.
And the kids forgave them.
Yeah. And it actually strengthened their relationship. It's like honesty can create those same kinds of club goods within a family.
Totally. And they even talk about families making collective decisions to delay getting their kids smartphones, like it's a shared sacrifice that benefits everyone.
So pro-social shame can actually be a positive force in our lives.
Right. It can help us overcome negative patterns and strengthen our connections with others.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. What are the key takeaways? What are the lessons of the balance, as the sources put it?
Okay, so number one, constantly chasing pleasure and avoiding pain actually leads to more pain.
That's a good one. What's number two?
Number two, recovery often starts with abstinence. You got to give your brain a break to reset.
Number three.
Abstinence helps your brain's reward system get back to normal so you can start enjoying simpler things again.
Makes sense. Number four.
Self-binding is crucial. You have to create those barriers, both physical and mental, between yourself and the things you overdo.
Especially in our dopamine-drenched world. What's number five?
Medication can help restore balance, but we have to be careful not to medicate away all of our pain. Sometimes pain is a teacher.
That's a really good point. And finally, number six.
Sometimes you have to embrace discomfort. Pressing on the pain side in a healthy way can actually lead to greater pleasure and well-being.
Wow, those are some powerful lessons. And on that note, here's a question for you, our listener.
Right.
What does your pleasure-pain balance look like? What's tipping the scales in your life?
Yeah, and more importantly, what's one small step you can take, based on what we've talked about, to move towards a healthier, more balanced existence?
Food for thought. Thanks for joining us.
See ya!
Thank you for listening. If this episode resonated with you, the best way to support the podcast is to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Every bit of support helps us keep creating content that actually matters. See you in the next one.